So when catastrophes like this happen, there are a few questions that always seem to come up. First, how could this have been prevented? And second, what can we do moving forward to make sure it doesn't happen again? Well, it seems now more than ever we are in need of some big ideas, some big thinkers. You know, here in the U.S., we've, of course, got Steve Jobs, of course. But his big ideas make our lives easier, more fun and interesting. What about those ideas that will actually sustain life, give our future a better chance of, well, happening? One of these ideas is fusion, the bonding of atoms at extremely high temperatures to create energy. Not oil, not coal, not gas, fusion. To talk more about this, I want to go down to Marty Hoffert in Great Neck, New York. He's a retired physicist from NYU and also a senior fellow at the Breakthrough Institute. Marty, give us the ins and outs of fusion and why an idea like this would be beneficial to the future.
Let me just quickly, of course I'm going to answer you, but let me just quickly respond to something you said before, which is, why did this happen and does it have to happen again? I mean, I believe that in the near term, in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, we're going to really need to explore the nuclear option, the fission option, before we get to fusion. And I believe also, and many other engineers and scientists believe, that we can make fission power plants a lot safer than they are right now. And so we ought to be devoting significant resources to doing that. As far as fusion, fusion has been a promise since the early days when we realized we could make fusion weapons in the 1950s. The first nuclear reactor, which was in 1943, within 10 years, we had built a commercial nuclear reactor after Fermi's experiments that 10 years earlier. And yet, it's been almost 60 years since the first hydrogen bomb, and we still don't have fusion. And everyone asks that question, why is fusion 10 or 20 years in the future and always is that far in the future? And the answer is it's a very tough problem, but it's a problem that I think we're going to solve eventually. There is a program going on right now, a project in the south of France, to build a commercial fusion, or not to build a commercial fusion reactor, but to understand the science of whether we can get energy from seawater by fusing hydrogen.
And you're talking about this ITER project, right? The International
Yes,
Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. And
that's correct. It's an international project. It's going to cost between $10 and $20 billion. And I don't think we're going to be able to count on any power realistically from fusion until 2030 or beyond. The problems we have in energy, our civilization runs on energy the way the Roman Empire ran on slavery. It is inconceivable that we can run our civilization without a sustainable source of energy that is sufficiently long-lived and safe. And if you look at the options that are available, nuclear fission is in the picture. So in the near term, we've got to work on improving nuclear fission. But the fundamental issue in the United States is that we're not committing enough financial resources to this problem. The U.S. Department of Energy has a budget of about $25 billion for all forms of energy, and most of that is coal and nuclear, whereas the Chinese have committed 3 times as much energy, investment. They're going to be devoting of the order of $75 billion annually to develop renewable energy sources. And it has actually paid off for them in the sense that China has ramped up to about 50% of solar photovoltaics in a short time.
Marty, I want to interject here just a second, because you've made so many very interesting points here. The difference between China and the U.S. in terms of their investment. I want to talk about, first of all, this isn't how it's always been in the U.S. The U.S. has, a few decades ago, invested in things that they didn't understand, that they didn't know where they were going to go. So I want you to talk about that, sort of the change in the attitude, both public attitude, in investors, and in political leaders, leaders who, no matter what, are not going to see, the benefits reaped by these programs in their terms, but they still went for it before. Also, I want you to talk about sort of why, here we're in Washington, as you know, and so I want you to talk about why, oil, you talk about oil, gas, and coal, so much being invested in these elements and not sort of the more unknown. and how that could be really detrimental to the future.
Well, you may be surprised at how I look at this. Obviously, there's an enormous infrastructure in fossil fuels, and I believe that we're going to have to phase fossil fuels out within the next 50 years, and that's the president's position as well, if we're going to reduce CO2 emissions by 80% by the middle of the century. And most scientists who are familiar with climate change realize that that's a goal that we should be pursuing. Why are we not pursuing it with enough vigor? Why aren't we really investing what resources we have? And the answer I have that may surprise you is that I think that our image of the future, our vision of the future, is dramatically different now than it was when I was growing up in an earlier geologic era, which was right after World War II in the 1950s and 60s, when scientists had actually performed what seemed to be miracles of technology development. And when people were planning to go to the moon and colonize the solar system, there was a basic belief that the future was going to be a better place for our children and for our descendants, and we were going to get there through science and technology. We don't see science and technology like that anymore. We don't have the best and the brightest of our young people in the United States, at least, studying science and technology. And that's something that has to change.
Marty, it seems that the best and the brightest, at least in this country, do one of two things. They go to Wall Street, or they go, if they stay in technology, they're developing things, you know, like iPods and iPads and new computers, things that make our lives, you know, more fulfilling and fun, but not things, as you say, that sustain life.
Well, I think we've just seen what the effect of having this generation of people going in, you know, aspiring to be hedge fund managers rather than engineers and technologists. Look, the thing that's made the United States great over the past 200 years has been a history of science and technology and technological innovation. And I know this is that your network is affiliated with Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, and I believe that many great things were invented in Russia. There was a time when there was a competition of who was inventing more. But that's been the strong point of the U.S. You're mentioning Apple, which is a place that my son actually worked at for 7 years and knew Steve Jobs. And I think that if the United States is going to be successful in emerging from this economic malaise that we're involved in right now, we're going to have to create entire new industries that were created similarly during World War II, for example, by FDR, when we were in the depths of a depression. The ratio of debt to GDP in the depression was about 50%, about the same as it is right now. And by the end of World War II, it went up to about 120%, much more than it is right now. And that was because the American people borrowed from themselves to completely reindustrialize the United States. By the end of the war, the United States was the most economically powerful country in the world. We had almost 50% of the world's GDP. If it's such a bad thing to spend money because the economy is in terrible shape, how do the opponents of increased spending, increased investment in alternate energy explain that? In my opinion, it's nonsense economically, and that's the economic part. The other part, which I mentioned before, is the vision part. How do we imagine the future? Everything that exists in this world had to exist first in the man-made world, had to exist first in somebody's mind, and that's probably the most important resource.
All right, Marty, unfortunately we are out of time, but some really, really important questions that you raised, and important to look back and see how different it is now from just a few decades ago. Marty Hoffert, Senior Fellow at the Breakthrough Institute and retired NYU physicist.
Thank you very much.